So it is my pleasure to introduce today's webinar presenter, Dr. Alexandra White. She is the Statman investigator at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And there she leads the Environment and Cancer Epidemiology Working Group. Really relevant to what she's going to talk to us about today is that she leads the sister study cohort, which is a long-standing study on the environment and cancer, very similar in design to what we're trying to do in MyCares. So Dr. White, welcome, and we're excited to hear your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to come speak today. I'm excited to be here and share some of the work we've been doing and to answer your questions. So today I'm going to talk about a few studies that we've conducted focusing on the relationship between chemical hair products and the risk of uterine, ovarian, and breast cancer. So as I'm sure we all know, hair product use is very common and it tends to start at early ages. So some estimates suggest that over half of US women above the age of 40 and older use hair dye. And we also know that other hair products are very common, such as hair relaxers and straighteners. These products are used to relax or straighten naturally curly hair, and thus are more commonly used by Black or African American women. And studies suggest that these products in particular, for those use tends to start in adolescence. So this is data from the Study of Environment, Lifestyle, and Fiber, their self-study, which is also conducted at NIEHS. And they asked women who are in their mid-30s, and these are predominantly Black women living in Detroit, about their use of hair relaxers and straighteners over their lifetime. And so you can see from this figure, the blue shades indicates using these products twice or more a year. So you can see that at age 5, about 12% of women reported already using relaxers or straighteners. And this increased during adolescence, reaching almost over 80% by age 15. And then use declined somewhat into adulthood. And this is potentially concerning because we know that hair products may be a possible source of chemical exposure. For example, studies have shown that hair dye and body waving or perming products contain thousands of different chemicals. And one group of chemicals that's been noted of concern is aromatic amines. And these have been shown in studies of rodents and mice to induce mammary tumors. And one study found that women who use hair dye were about 8 times more likely to have these aromatic amine DNA adducts measured in their breast ductal epithelial cells. And this study is really important because it tells us that the chemicals that we're putting on our head are absorbed through the scalp, entering the bloodstream and traveling throughout the body to potentially sensitive tissues such as the breast. And then once reaching there, in this case, for these chemicals, are binding to the DNA, which can be considered a potential initiating event for cancer. Chemical straighteners and relaxers have also been of concern, and it's been pretty well publicized that certain formulations of these products release formaldehyde, which is a carcinogenic gas when heat is applied as part of the normal application of these products. Studies also have shown that straighteners and relaxers contain a number of different endocrine disrupting compounds, or EDCs, such as phthalates, parabens, and metals. And EDCs are chemicals that can mimic or interfere with our body's natural hormone process, and thus could be important for health outcomes. So this figure shows the incidence of cancer among women in the US. Breast cancer is the most common cancer diagnosed both in the US and worldwide. And it's estimated that in 2023, there'll be almost 300,000 women diagnosed with breast cancer. Uterine cancer is the most common cancer of the female reproductive tract. This is less common than breast cancer, but it's concerning because incidence of uterine cancer is rising, and it's particularly rising among Black women, and we don't really know why. And ovarian cancer, although it's not one of the most common cancers diagnosed among women in the US, it is a significant contributor to mortality, and it's estimated to contribute to about 5% of cancer-related deaths among women in the US. And all 3 of these cancers together are considered hormone-sensitive cancers. And what that means is that these cancers are hypothesized to be dependent on hormones, such as estrogen and progestin, for growth. And this is demonstrated by the fact that these cancers share some similar risk factors. For example, obesity, a woman's reproductive history, so how many babies she's had, when she had those babies, a history of breastfeeding, as well as use of exogenous hormones, so taking oral contraceptives or hormone therapy for menopause. All of these factors are thought to impact cancer risk, potentially, at least in part by acting through this pathway of increasing your lifetime exposure to hormones. And so it's possible that these chemicals may also act on this pathway, particularly those with these endocrine disrupting capabilities. So the objective of this research was to better understand how use of these chemical hair products that may contain these carcinogens and endocrine disrupting chemicals might be related to the risk of breast, ovarian, and uterine cancer risk. And so this work was done in the sister study cohort, which is a large prospective cohort of women across the US. So this map shows the residences for all of our women. And so at the time that they were enrolled, which was between 2003 and 2009, and the sister study is unique in that all of our participants have a sister, either half or full, who was diagnosed with breast cancer, making her eligible to join the study. So they all have this familial risk of breast cancer, which does put them at a higher risk of going on to develop breast cancer and other cancers potentially over their life course. So at the time they enrolled in the study, all of our women completed a home visit. We collected biologic samples, and they completed an extremely extensive questionnaire. This cohort is ongoing. We have annual health updates where they let us know about any new health conditions, as well as more detailed follow-up surveys every 2 to 3 years. So in the data I'm going to show today, we have had almost 3,000 breast cancer cases diagnosed in the cohort, 240 ovarian cancer cases, and over 370 uterine cancer cases. And so during that baseline home visit, when they completed all of those extensive questionnaires, one of those was on their use of personal care products. And so this also included an extensive assessment of their use of chemical hair products. So this is an example of one of the questions on our questionnaire. And it reads, in the past 12 months, how frequently have you or someone else straightened or relaxed your hair or used pressing products? And the response options were did not use, 1 to 2 times a year, and every 3 to 4 months, which we collapsed into 4 or fewer times a year. And then a few more response options that we also collapsed to being greater than 4 times per year. So this is a pretty simple one question. And we asked similar questions for permanent hair dye, semi-permanent hair dye, temporary dyes, as well as hair perms and body waves. So just to give you an idea of what the sister study cohort looks like, on average, they were about 55 years of age when they enrolled in the study, but we do have a pretty wide age range between 35 and 75. The cohort is 9% Black, 5% Hispanic, and 84% non-Hispanic white. And about half have a bachelor's degree or higher, and a third reported annual household income greater than $100,000 a year. So this is a slightly higher socioeconomic status population. So when we looked at the data for reporting using these products, as expected, we see that use of straighteners and relaxers is much more common among the women in the sister study who self-reported to being Black or African American, which is what we would expect based on the most common uses of these products. So for example, you can see in this figure, these are the percent responding to never use 4 or fewer times per year and greater than 4 times per year. The dark bars are non-Hispanic white, and then the hatched bars are African American or Black women. And you can see that Black women in the cohort are more likely to report ever use, and they're much more likely to report more frequent use of these products. So I'm going to start by showing our results for the relationship between these chemical hair products and breast cancer. So I'm going to take a moment just to walk through this figure because we're going to see a few more figures that look a lot like this. So this main figure shows the association between ever use of these products in the 12 months before baseline compared to those who say they did not. These are hazard ratios, which are just a measure of the association. So if the hazard ratio is greater than 1, that indicates that using these products was associated with a higher risk of breast cancer. And the confidence intervals, which are the bars, if they include 1, it indicates that the estimate is not statistically significant. And if they exclude 1, it indicates it is statistically significant, meaning that we have more confidence in that association. So for example, here in this figure, we see that reporting ever using permanent hair dye in the 12 months before baseline was associated with about a 9% higher incidence of breast cancer. And this was statistically significant. We also saw an 18% higher risk of breast cancer for using straighteners in the past 12 months, although this confidence interval did include 1. So it's not statistically significant, but suggestive of a higher risk. So next we broke this down based on those frequency of use categories. So whether they used it 4 or fewer times a year versus more than 4 times per year. And so we see here that this association with hair straighteners, so the blue dots indicates more frequent use. We see this association become apparent when we focus on those women who are more frequent users of straighteners. And so for them, we see that frequent use in the past 12 months at baseline is associated with about a 35% higher risk of breast cancer. And so because we know that use of these products and use of a lot of other personal care products really varies by race, we looked at this association only among non-Hispanic white women and only among Black women. And so for permanent dye, we see that the association for non-Hispanic white women is pretty similar to what we saw overall, but we do see the stronger association for permanent dye use among Black women. In contrast, for the straighteners and relaxers, the association is pretty similar whether or not the women are white or Black. Okay, so now we're going to move into the ovarian cancer findings. So this figure is similar to the one we just showed for breast cancer. So looking at ever and ever use of these products in relation to ovarian cancer risk. And you can see we see little evidence of an association with permanent dyes, temporary dyes, straighteners, or the hair perms or body waves. And then again, when we take into account frequency of use, we do see this association become evident for the straighteners and relaxers. So again, among our most frequent users of straighteners and relaxers, we saw over a doubling of a risk of going on to develop ovarian cancer. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about uterine cancer, which are our more recent findings. So for uterine cancer, when we look at ever and ever use of these products, across the dyes and coloring products, we don't see any evidence of an increase, but we do see an association with ever use of straighteners and relaxers. So we see about an 80% increase in risk for ever use. And when we break it down by frequency, we again see this increase in risk, particularly for the more frequent users. So we see a slight increase of 20% higher risk for less frequent use. But this association is really being driven by those most frequent users, so reporting using them more than 4 times in the past year. And similar to when we looked at this with breast cancer, we stratified by race here and looked at it the association between relaxers and uterine cancer risk among non-Hispanic white and Black women separately, and the associations remain very similar across these groups. So I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about what these risk estimates mean, because I know that when we say that using these products doubles your risk of ovarian or uterine cancer risk, that those are very alarming numbers to hear, particularly if you've used these products or someone you love use these products. And so it's important to think about these in context of this outcome in general. So we're just taking the example of uterine cancer here. So for uterine cancer, the risk of any woman in the US going on to develop uterine cancer by age 70 is about 1.5%. And in the sister study, we estimate this to be slightly higher, about 1.6%, which could be due to the fact that women in the sister study do have a family history of breast cancer. So you can see this figure here shows 100 women. So if we had 100 women, we would expect about 1.5 of them to go on to develop uterine cancer by age 70. So we estimated the risk difference, and that is the increase in risk that you see for using these products on top of that baseline risk of 1.6. And so we see that ever use of straightener relaxers is associated with about a 1% higher risk, and that frequent use is associated with about a 2.4% higher risk. So when you take that 2.4 and you add it to that baseline risk of 1.6, you end up with about a 4% risk. So in this case, if we look at all of these 100 women, and they were all frequent users of straighteners and relaxers, we would anticipate about 4 of them going on to develop uterine cancer by age 70. And so if you're wondering, how does this compare back to that number you were telling me earlier about doubling? If you take that 4 women divided by about 1.5 women is how we get to about 2.5. So the point in showing this here is to understand that while the increase in risk that we observe for using these products is statistically significant and notable, this outcome in itself is very rare. So the increase that we see on a population level is small. So in conclusion, in our sister study cohort, which is a large prospective study across the US, we observed a higher risk for breast, ovarian, and uterine cancer, all 3 of these hormone-sensitive cancers, among women who reported frequently using relaxers and straighteners or pressing products. It's important to note that these findings, particularly for ovarian and uterine cancer, are the first studies to demonstrate this association. So we'd really like to see these findings confirmed in different populations, particularly those that are more racially and ethnically diverse, because we know that women's use of personal care products, especially hair products, really varies based on race because of different hair textures and needs. We also are, the study is really relying on, a single question to assess exposure to these products, and we didn't ask about brands or specific chemicals. So there's a lot more that we need to know about what chemicals might be driving this risk. And although when we looked at this association among Black women and white women separately, we saw that they were, similar magnitude of association, it's important to note that these findings are much more relevant and have a larger impact for Black women, given the fact that we know they have such a higher prevalence of use of these products. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators across these different studies, as well as the sister study participants for being a part of these studies. And I'm happy, I know we're gonna go through some questions, but I also included my email here. If you think of something later and wanna reach out directly, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Lexi. That was great. I think we'll just launch right into some questions, and actually one that came in advance of the webinar today was one that I also wrote down while you were talking. So I'm curious about whether the increased risk you saw among Black women with hair dye, if you think that is a reflection of the types of products that are used
yeah,
for Black women.
That was a really unexpected, finding, and I think it does suggest the possibility that there could be different types of products being used based on hair texture, or different, responses to the products based on hair texture that could be driving that difference. But I would also note that it's possible, we had relatively few Black women who were, frequent users of hair dye, so it could be somewhat by chance. So it definitely needs to be replicated in other studies. But yeah, it's definitely something that was surprising to us as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And so what about other gynecologic conditions like fibroids or PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome? Is there any evidence?
So there is some evidence that the hair relaxers are also associated with uterine fibroids. And this is, I think, a very compelling research question, because we know that Black women tend to be diagnosed earlier with uterine fibroids and have more uterine fibroids. And so it's definitely an important association to understand better. That's something that we're also exploring in the sister study. So hopefully we'll be able to contribute there as well. And then I know a study came out just recently, a few weeks ago, showing that hair relaxer use was also associated with decreased ability to get pregnant. So I think that this is kind of a research area that's just starting to really, start to delve into the potential health impacts of these products across, I focus here on hormone sensitive cancers because that's my research area, but I think it's definitely plausible that these could be related to a whole host of outcomes that have, endocrine disruption, as a potential cause, such as reproductive and uterine fibroids.
That's super interesting. All right, so we have some specific questions around how do you know what types of products to buy, what might be safer. There's, if you go to Target, there's the clean section. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, so I get asked that question a lot, and I understand that, we all, want to make good choices and be aware of these things. And I want to start just by addressing kind of this inherent challenge, which is that a lot of times, we don't really know for sure what's in these products. There have been some studies comparing what are reported on labels to what's actually measured in the products, and they do not usually align very well. And that could be due to the fact that there's chemicals that are introduced from packaging or contamination, or that the reporting is just, not complete. But I just want to emphasize that this is really difficult to pick products and to be an informed consumer, and to acknowledge that these products are not regulated in a way that we do in this country for pharmaceuticals. There's very little in terms of testing for long-term health impacts on these products, and so it is really difficult. And I think by the time that a chemical of interest is often identified, or chemical of concern, it's often replaced by a similar chemical, which then we kind of have to start the process over again of understanding the health impacts. With that being said, there are definitely some resources that people can use. There is the Environmental Working Group's database on personal care products. There's also an app called Think Dirty. So it's something that you can try to look up your products and avoid certain chemicals such as phthalates and parabens. And, for example, for the hair straighteners and relaxers, definitely trying to find formaldehyde-free versions. It's not often listed as formaldehyde. It's listed as methylene glycol, but methylene glycol becomes formaldehyde when it becomes a gas. So, I think that there are resources and there are ways to look for better products. There's, been a big interest and movement towards clean beauty products. Places like Sephora have a whole clean beauty website that you can go through. But I would suggest to kind of take those with a grain of salt and know that you might not be able to really understand fully what's in the products.
Yeah, super, super challenging. Now, what about dry shampoos? I've never even understood what's in a dry shampoo and how it works.
Magic.
But
It's magic. So yeah, for those of you that don't know, there were some dry shampoos that were recalled based on benzene exposure, which is thought to be part of kind of the aerosolized, like it's a spray, and that there's benzene release, which is a carcinogen. We are exposed to benzene, often at the gas station. It's in our air. So, we haven't studied dry shampoo, so it's hard for me to comment, kind of in the context of, these outcomes. We didn't ask about that in the study, but, I think it's, something, definitely make sure you're not using any of those recalled products. And, hopefully we can push for, having better, like larger structural changes to the, products versus everyone making their own decision.
yeah, so why do you think that there is a lack of regulation of these products? I mean, I think it's kind of broadly the
It's
system we're in, but
right. It's really challenging. I think that it's challenging to do because, there's thousands and, even millions of chemicals out there. And there's a lot of proprietary issues where people, companies don't want to release what's in their products because it's, part of their business. But other companies or other places are, right, the EU regulates chemicals in personal care products. California has made an effort. So you might, if you bought something online, that because some of them are coming now with labels. I got a footstool that I ordered that came with a label that it has phthalates in it, and that phthalates have some evidence of carcinogenic activity. So when one state like California does that, it does kind of trickle down to the rest of us. I live in North Carolina, but I still got the warning label. As companies have to adapt to these regulations, it does tend to kind of filter out. So, it's challenging, but I think that we can probably do better.
yeah. So are there advocacy routes that you can see that people could take to try to get more regulations or hold companies accountable?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there is a lot of interest in this and a lot of awareness. And I met with the FDA director a few months ago, and he knows that, these studies exist. So I don't have good advice for specific places to go, but I, think it would be great if we didn't have to rely on individuals to make these choices for themselves, and that, the products we were given the options to have were safer.
Yeah. So with respect specifically to the sister study, do you study their sisters, and are you able to make comparisons between the sister with cancer and the enrollee?
So generally, no. There is a small sub-study that's led by my colleague, Claire Weinberg, that has gone back and enrolled some of the early sisters and has done some genetic studies kind of comparing them. But in general, no, we don't. We do ask the women in our study to, report about, other family members who are diagnosed to kind of further understand, their underlying familial history. But yeah, we didn't go back and compare on a broad scale.
Yeah, it's hard, right, when you're starting a study,
Yeah.
because you think you've thought of everything, and then you think, oh, I could have, would have, should have done this a little bit differently. So now you gave us a couple of websites or apps to be thinking about, but kind of more broadly, are there specific ingredients that people can look for? You mentioned a sort of fancy name for formaldehyde. Are there others that come to mind?
I mean, yeah, I think that it's hard. There are metals are generally, you want to avoid exposure to lead. There's phthalates have had some other health effects that, it's kind of worth avoiding those if you can, but they're in a lot of plastics. So they tend to end up in a lot of our products. It's hard. There's a lot of them, and we don't really understand fully their effects. So it's hard to pick out one specifically.
Yeah, it's hard. We had a previous webinar on microplastics, and it's very complicated because it's not just the microplastic, but what might bind to the microplastic
Right.
that then gets into your body and disassociates, and now you're exposed to something you had no idea.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So so that is very, very tricky. So I know one of the things that we're both interested in is understanding what we call critical windows of susceptibility. And so what that means is that there are time points in our lives as our bodies are changing where we might respond differently to exposures. So those might be when you're going through puberty, or when you're pregnant. And I'm wondering if there are any data on how exposures during pregnancy are differentially impactful.
So not that I know of yet. And so we have added, so I mentioned in my talk that, the sister study is ongoing. So something that we have done is, as part of one of the follow-up surveys, kind of once we saw that first, paper with breast cancer and saw that signal, we went and we added to one of our survey kind of more complete questions. So, and really, not getting specifically a pregnancy, which I think would be great, but also challenging in this cohort of women who are now like in their 60s to 70s. But we are going to ask about decade specific use. So how often did you use these products in your 20s? How often did you use them in your 30s, 40s, and try to get at least kind of at that idea of, during the reproductive time period of a woman's life in her, 20s to 30s, is that the exposure that matters the most? Or is it really recent exposure? And I get a lot of questions from people being like, okay, so I use these products, but I haven't for so long now, is that okay? And so, kind of trying to understand a more complete measure of exposure, because really here we're just working with the like 12 months before baseline as this proxy for your adult use, and that's not ideal. So we are trying to do a more comprehensive exposure assessment.
Yeah, so we're in my cares, we are, over the first couple of years people are enrolled, we're getting that kind of lifetime exposure in your teens, in your 20s, 30s, and so on. Because I don't really see without that level of information how you move forward. And also in my cares, because our participants are younger, between 25 and 44, we hope to be able to do additional surveys when they're pregnant.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think the sister study is not the right place for it, but I think that it would be great if other studies did, and it is really important. I was going to say something about, I don't know, maybe it'll come back to me.
All right. Well, so I want to move into a topic that Kennedy raised in the Q&A, and it's something we were talking about offline before the webinar started. And I'll just read Kennedy's questions, which is, in your follow-up, will you look into the reasoning for women using these products, such as societal beauty standards, hair prejudice in the workplace, et cetera? And I think, we can kind of expand that topic a bit to say that there are equity issues in having access to clean products, being able either to get them, period, or cost differentials and so on. So I just wondered if you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was not part, so we didn't include in the questionnaire why you were doing it, but I think that's a really interesting point. We do have some self-reported measures of discrimination that we could consider in conjunction with these exposures, and I think that could be really great. And I also want to definitely acknowledge that I recognize that using these products, especially the straighteners and relaxers, is a very complicated decision for people, and there's a lot of societal pressures to conform to these beauty norms, and so I don't think that it's as easy as saying like just don't use these products, and that's really important to point out. And so one of the things we're talking about is clean beauty movement, and this idea that people want to buy products that are clean and are better and have less chemicals. And one of the concerns I have with that movement is that it could exacerbate some of the equity issues we see. We know that minoritized women in the US tend to have higher levels of these chemicals in their blood, of these personal care product related chemicals. And so by having these more expensive and more difficult, it's kind of raises the question of like, who's going and buying these products that are more expensive, that are harder to find, that take more effort. And then this could potentially, increase the the disparity that we see in the chemical biomarkers that we measure in people's blood and the use of these products. But yeah, this is, I come at this as a, cancer epidemiologist who is interested in how these products are related to cancer, but it's important to take into account the larger societal context of why people use these products and who has access to these products, and, why they've been understudied for a long time.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think ideally ways in which we can start to get some knowledge, build a knowledge base around this is through qualitative research, where we do focus groups with participants based on their patterns of use, or offer some storytelling, kind of narrative building of people's experiences. And I think, those are certainly things we'd like to do in my cares as we build out. And I'm sure you guys are thinking along those lines too.
And I know there's some work happening, I think at Columbia, working with the qualitative, aspect you're talking about, and also like working with people about how, so this product is, not potentially, has these chemicals. How do we kind of switch to other products? And, I think that is also like extremely useful, and it like works better in kind of smaller settings versus kind of our large cohort studies like Sisters.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are complicated,
Yes.
Worldwide
Yeah.
society issues, but I think as scientists we can really start to at least shed some light on.
Yeah, and raise awareness,
Yeah.
and recognize that we're just kind of hoping to help give people information, and hopefully that leads to change or different decisions as people feel fit. But it's a tough topic.
Yeah, it's difficult, and it's also just trying to navigate the path of what is clean.
Exactly.
Across the board. All right, so we have a question moving back to probably your first slide, which is, could you talk a little bit more about what aromatic amines are and how they play a role in hormone-sensitive cancers?
Yeah, so aromatic amines are a group of chemicals that are defined by having these structures that are circular, have amine groups on them. And so they're most commonly found in the products that put dye on it, hair, and permanent dye in particular. It changes. It's permanent. It changes the color of the hair shaft, and so it's not just depositing color, but it's changing it, because there's other products that kind of wash out. It's a semi-permanent dye, and so those are less harsh. So it's one of the chemicals of concern, because we know in animal studies that we see it acting particularly as a breast carcinogen. But I use it as an example, but there's a lot of chemicals in these products, and it's really hard to pinpoint a single one as being the most important one. And this is one of the things I was going to mention earlier. One of the other challenges here is that a lot of these formulations change over time. So not only are they proprietary, so hard to get a hold of, but there's shifts in the market. And for example, the Brazilian keratin treatments that were really popular in the early 2000s, are the ones that are typically linked with the formaldehyde exposure, and there's these shifts that happen. And so that's one of the other aspects about our new exposure assessment, kind of looking over the life course, is I think you could easily see these changes, over time. Sorry, my dogs are barking at someone. Go
on. Yep. So I think what Lexi's talking about is really to fully understand these exposures, we have to understand when they were happening, because there is so much change in the products. So another question that came in from James is about labeling of products, and is there a requirement around, you know, like potential cancer causing chemicals or ingredients in the product?
Yeah, I mean, so there are so the label is supposed to be accurate. Like that's the guidelines, is that they're supposed to accurately reflect what's in there. But there was a really, I think, important study that came out a few years ago, I think it's 2018, that showed they went and they took products off the shelves of the store and they went and they ran them on a machine and, you know, identified the different chemicals that were present. And they really did not correspond with what the label says. And it's really hard to know, you know, I think I said this a little bit earlier, but if this is, you know, contamination from, you know, the plastic container it was in, is this, you know, a breakdown kind of product or, you know, something else. So, but I think the important takeaway message is that we can't always count on the labels to accurately tell us what's in the product.
Yeah, super tricky. And are organic products different from clean products? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I think my general sense is that, you know, probably it's better in some ways, but again, they're also not undergoing any safety testing. And so it's something that, you know, it's probably better, but we don't have a lot of backing for that always.
Yeah. So we have another question about how often people should get screened for these hormone sensitive cancers. And so do you want to take that? Or I can take it.
I am, you know, I think people should consult with their family, if they're, you know, physician. You know, there's recommendations out there about screening, but the screening guidelines could be different for you if you have a family history. And so that's definitely a personalized, you know, question that I would, you know, take to your physician.
Yeah. And broadly, there is screening for breast cancer, but there isn't recommended screening for ovarian or uterine cancer. But we do always want to be aware of abnormal bleeding with respect to uterine cancer. But as Dr. White said, consult with your healthcare provider about your individual situation. All right, so I had missed that Kennedy had raised their hand. And so Kennedy, if you raise your hand again, I can unmute you, but I can't do it unless you raise your hand. There you go, perfect. Whoops. All right, I think you should be able to talk now, Kennedy.
Okay. Hi. This is an amazing study. I've heard so much about it. As a Black woman myself, I have experience with, you know, getting relaxers, especially from a very young age. It was very normalized, especially in the rural area that I grew up in. I also wanted to bring up, I put it in the chat, but I can just bring up how there's, you know, if there is a qualitative study done, also kind of looking into, you know, the lack of knowledge that women had when it came to taking care of their hair, the lack of hair products that were available, specifically affordable hair care products, and the lack of promotion of Black owned or POC owned hair products. I feel like that's something that's also very important to look at, especially now with the natural hair movement becoming more prevalent now. But obviously, it comes in waves. Obviously, there was a movement back in, I would say, like the 60s and 70s. And, you know, it comes and goes. But I think that's just also something to think about if a qualitative study were to be done as well.
I think those are all great points.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's just making me think more about how we do a lot of qualitative work, and this is an area where we could definitely do some work. So thanks to Kennedy for making us think a little bit harder about that. It's great. All right, we are at 12:45. I think we have answered all of the questions that came in, so right on time. I will say that MyCares has already produced a visual abstract about the findings from Dr. White's study on uterine cancer, and we're happy to send that out. It's been in our newsletter, and it will appear on our website very soon. And we will also develop a summary of today's webinar as well to go along with that. And as always, we encourage you to email us with webinar topics or questions that you have that you'd like to see developed into kind of user-friendly information dissemination, which is a big part of our mission here at MyCares. So again, thank you so much, Dr. White, for talking to us today, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone at our webinar next month.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everyone for all the great questions.